In the cold, damp corridors of medieval England, his name still echoes like a curse. John, the king without honor. The shadow beneath a dying crown. Not even the chroniclers of his time could veil their contempt. He was the monarch who lost a kingdom, murdered blood, and choked his own people with taxes and fear. His enemies said even hell refused him entry. But was King John merely a failure, or something far darker? A schemer, a poisoner, a man who would see blood spilled before losing his grip on power. Tonight, we open the Book of Shadows and turn to the chapter written in betrayal, sealed in blood. Not every king is divinely chosen. Some wear the crown not to rule, but to wreak havoc, like a storm with a voice, a mind, and a thirst for vengeance. England, 12th century, a land torn between scripture and spilled blood. Beneath the spires of cathedrals reaching skyward like desperate fingers toward salvation, peasants bowed not in prayer, but in hunger, taxation, and endless war. And within the glittering heart of the Angevin Empire, a child cried for the first time. Not blessed, not celebrated. John Plantagenet, youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, was born not as heir, but as excess. No land, no title, no divine aura, like his brother, Richard the Lionheart. They called him Lackland, a name like a wound that never scabbed. But those who laughed at him in youth died early and painfully. Within the cold stone halls of Winchester Castle, ancient prophecies were whispered to those who dared to listen. When the landless son wears the crown, royal blood shall weep from the throne. And so it began. The blood did not gush. Not at first. It dripped, silently, relentlessly, until it soaked the foundations of a kingdom. John grew beneath the shadow of giants. Most of all, Richard, the Crusader king, beloved to the point of sainthood, whose name was etched in both prayer and blade. But when Richard died, felled not by noble steel, but by the arrow of a nameless peasant, the curse stirred. John did not ascend by virtue, but by vacancy. In the year 1199, John became King of England. There were no thunderous cheers, no triumphal procession. Only cold glances and whispers like wind through broken tombs. A king unloved, a king born of absence, and destined to rule through fear. From the very beginning, the omens darkened. Courtrooms brimmed with false accusations. Loyal men hung for the flicker of suspicion, and the royal court became a crucible where vengeance fermented like poisoned wine. And so, like the first specter of a coming age of dread, John sat the throne not as a giver of justice, but as the harbinger of silent deaths. He inherited not a crown of gold, but a throne built of bones, and the silence of men too afraid to speak their truths. When Richard the Lionheart perished, the crown did not simply pass to John. It clung to him, like a stain, like a blade refusing to be sheathed. But inheritance is never without contest. And in the cold alleys of politics, bloodlines matter less than steel. And fear. John's claim was fragile. France whispered of Arthur of Brittany, a boy with a cleaner lineage, a heart not yet blackened by power. Nobles murmured in corners. Priests hesitated at his coronation, and enemies gathered like vultures on a battlefield not yet bloodied. John responded not with words, but with war. He captured Arthur, a child, his nephew, his blood. He had him locked in the dungeons of Rouen, where iron-kissed flesh and screams were swallowed by stone. The boy vanished soon after. No body, no funeral, no forgiveness. But the river told the truth. Fishermen found bones near the castle's edge. Bones too small for a soldier. Bones of royalty dumped like offal. And from that moment, John was no longer merely unloved. He was feared. The French called him John the Softsword, mocking his lack of courage. But softness was never his sin. Cruelty was. He ravaged Normandy with fire, torching villages whose only crime was loyalty to another name. Castles were razed not for strategy, but for spectacle. He taxed barons until they choked, sold justice like bread in a famine, and demanded loyalty not with gold, but with nooses. The nobility watched in terror, for this was no king of diplomacy. This was a monarch of malice. Whispers rose again, this time not in foreign courts, but within England's own heart. Barons began to conspire, not out of ambition, but out of desperation. And so, as the shadows thickened and friends became fewer, King John stood in his hall of hollow allies, blind to the fact that the greatest betrayal was not in the dungeon, but in the silence of those who remained. There are kings who wage war against men, but John, he waged war against God. The year was 1205, and death had grown familiar with John's court, not as a visitor, but as a resident. But now, the enemy he chose was not mortal. It was the church itself. The Archbishop of Canterbury had died. And as was tradition, the Pope, Innocent III, put forth his own candidate, a humble learned man named Stephen Langton. But John, ever suspicious, refused him. He declared, as only tyrants do, that no foreign priest would dictate to an English crown. It was a dangerous game. The Pope responded with a thunderbolt from the heavens. He excommunicated John. Suddenly, England became a kingdom without sacraments. No baptisms, no marriages, no burials. The dead rotted above ground, unblessed, unburied, their souls denied passage into heaven. Priests fled, bells fell silent, crosses were torn down in fear. It was not just a curse, it was a vacuum, and into that vacuum terror rushed. John responded as only a cornered beast would. He confiscated church lands, tortured clergy who defied him, and hanged monks from the trees that once shaded their monasteries. Coins stamped with holy symbols were melted down. He mocked the Pope openly in court, calling him a meddling rat in Rome. But even among his enemies, God had many friends. The common folk began to whisper that John's cruelty was now cosmic, that plagues and storms were punishments not from nature, but from heaven itself. Crops failed. Livestock died, and John's image darkened further, from tyrant to blasphemer. And then came a legend, whispered by candlelight in peasant homes and castle kitchens, that John had made a pact with the devil, that in exchange for power he had offered England's soul. And perhaps, in a sense, he had. In secret chambers beneath the castle, he began keeping books of forbidden knowledge, studying strange alchemy and poisons. A new obsession bloomed, not with justice or glory or even conquest, but with control. He did not want to rule by divine right. He wanted to rule by fear alone. And as the church turned its back and the nobility began to question, John stood ever more alone, a man not born to be king, but to be remembered as the warning carved in stone. No man is born a tyrant, but when a king forgets he is mortal, the blade of rebellion is sharpened in silence. By 1212, England had become a nation of gritted teeth and clenched fists. The barons, those armored titans who once bent the knee, now whispered of resistance. They had tolerated his taxes, his confiscations, his brutal justice. But now their daughters were not safe. John, it is said, took whomever he desired. Noble blood be damned. He would rape the wives of his enemies, then force the men to dine with him while their humiliation still hung in the air. Even his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, heir to the Angevin line, had mysteriously disappeared in John's custody. Some say John drowned the boy with his own hands. Others whisper the prince's body was hacked to pieces and thrown into the Seine, weighted down with stones. A boy king unmade by blood and envy. The nobles could take no more. A plot to assassinate the king was uncovered. John's response was swift. Dozens were imprisoned, starved, and their lands seized. But he had not crushed the will to defy. He had merely nurtured it. Soon, a coalition of barons gathered in open rebellion, a storm cloaked in armor and banners. They demanded a charter, something never before seen in the realm, a declaration that even the king was not above the law. John laughed. He called them traitors, dogs, insects. He swore he would hunt them down like foxes and hang their corpses from the gates of their own castles. But in truth, he was afraid. For the first time in his life, he had no one left to betray, only enemies left to face. The land fractured. Castles fell like rotted teeth. Entire towns burned as John's troops and the rebels clashed in a war of attrition and vengeance. And through it all, the people watched in silence. Peasants, too, starved to care. Priests, too frightened to speak, and nobles who now spoke with steel. John's realm, once the pride of the Plantagenets, now resembled a chessboard soaked in blood, and the king. He remained on his throne not as a ruler, but as a man outwitted, outnumbered, and hated by God and man alike. It is a rare and terrifying sight when a king is made to kneel not by sword, but by ink and parchment. By the spring of 1215, England was burning, not from fire, but from rebellion made holy. The barons no longer bargained, they demanded. And so, in a meadow called Runnymede, by the gray-bellied Thames, something unthinkable happened. A king was forced to sign his own submission. The parchment bore a name now carved in the bones of history: Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was not a gift. It was not a negotiation. It was a noose woven from 63 clauses, each one a wound to John's pride. It bound the crown to the law. It forbade arbitrary imprisonment. It recognized justice not as royal favor, but as a right. It even demanded that a council of barons oversee the king, as if he were a disobedient child. John's seal was placed under threat, not loyalty. Surrounded by armed rebels, he gritted his teeth and dipped the wax, but in his heart he did not submit. He plotted. From the moment he returned to Windsor, his mind darkened with vengeance. He sent secret letters to Pope Innocent III, begging for the charter's annulment. "I was coerced," he wrote. "I signed not as a king, but as a captive." The Pope, ever eager to restore the divine right of monarchs, answered, "Magna Carta is null and void, an insult to the church and the crown." John laughed. The charter was burned. The promises ash. The rebellion, once cooled, was reignited into war. But he had miscalculated. The barons turned not just against John, but against England itself. And in their desperation, they invited a foreign prince, Louis of France, son of the French king, to take the English throne. The crown was now a prize in a continental chess match, and King John, he had become the most hated pawn of all, abandoned, cursed, and hunted by both his own blood and foreign blades. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here. There is no roar more silent than that of a dying king. The rebellion had become a flood, washing away every vestige of John's control. Castles fell like autumn leaves, and barons who once bent the knee now raised foreign banners over English soil. Louis of France, draped in blue and gold, had crossed the Channel with his army. He was not just a prince, he was a specter of foreign conquest, welcomed by English lords eager to trade tyranny for treason. King John, now a shadow of a sovereign, fled across the realm he no longer ruled. His footsteps echoed through the cold stone halls of empty keeps. He burned crops, poisoned wells, and torched towns. Scorched earth beneath the boots of his enemies and his own subjects. But the tide would not turn. Even the church, once his divine shield, looked away in quiet shame. In the autumn of 1216, he took refuge in the marshlands of Norfolk, dragging behind him the tattered remnants of his army and what little gold he had not spent or lost. And their fate delivered its cruelest blow. Attempting to cross the tidal estuary of the Wash, John's baggage train, laden with the royal treasury, sacred relics, and the last symbols of his crumbling might, was swallowed by the sea. His crown, his jewels, the legacy of his line, all sunk beneath the mud, lost to time and tide. The king himself made it to the far side, wet, sick, and broken. Fever gripped his body like the hands of specters past. He took to bed in the damp chambers of Newark Castle, his breath shallow, his eyes sunken. Around him, nobles whispered. Priests mumbled half-hearted blessings, but there was no mourning in their hearts. He asked for wine. He asked for peaches. He demanded a crown, but none remained. And in those final hours, haunted by betrayal, abandonment, and the ghosts of every oath he had ever broken, King John, the tyrant of England, began to rot before death took him. But even in death, his story was not yet finished. Some men leave behind kingdoms, others leave behind curses. The year was 1216. The tyrant was dead. King John, last son of the Angevin devils, breathed his final, rattling breath beneath the stone ceilings of Newark Castle. Unmourned, unloved, unmournable. There was no royal procession, no thunderous bells, no grieving crowds. His body, bloated and blackened by fever, was quietly transported to Worcester Cathedral, a place chosen more for its convenience than its sanctity. They buried him between two saints, hoping that proximity to the holy might mask the stench of his soul. But England was not yet free from his grasp. Prince Louis of France still claimed the throne. Civil war continued to rage, and the barons, now lost in a chaos they had helped unleash, scrambled to find a new center of power. Then, from the ashes of rebellion, a boy emerged. John's son Henry, barely 9 years old, was crowned in haste with a makeshift diadem. The barons, desperate for stability, placed their faith in this child, not because they believed in him, but because they could mold him. And so, the realm chose the lesser evil, the echo of tyranny rather than its source. But King John had left behind more than a fractured crown. He left debt, distrust, and a nation drained of loyalty. His reign had scarred the English soul, and no coronation could cleanse the blood he had spilled. In hushed halls, they whispered of his cruelty, of the murdered hostages, of the monks who cursed his name, of the queen he had discarded, and the brother he betrayed. And as his tomb grew cold, a new myth was born. Not of a king, but of a monster. A name that would echo through centuries. Not as ruler, but as warning. Some kings are remembered for the realms they built. John is remembered for the chains he forged. History did not forgive King John. He was not immortalized in song, nor enshrined in glory. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, etched into parchment and echoed in law. A tyrant so detested that even centuries could not bleach his sins from memory. His greatest enemy in death was not France, nor his rebellious barons, but the Magna Carta, the document forced from his trembling fingers in the meadow of Runnymede. Though he tried to destroy it, though he burned and defied its clauses, it survived him. It outlived him. And in time, it became the cornerstone of liberty. The irony is the man who trampled justice became the unintentional father of it. But do not be deceived. This was not redemption. It was condemnation. For a king to be remembered not for his virtue, but for what others wrestled from his cruelty, is the bitterest judgment of all. In portraits, John fades behind shadows. In chronicles, he is the oathbreaker, the coward, the poisoner. And in the whispers of monks and monarchs alike, he is simply the worst king in English history. No tomb of marble, no statue of gold can erase this truth. John ruled through fear and died in shame. And yet, perhaps that is where his true power lies. Not as a man, but as a warning. A voice from the past, echoing through the corridors of time, whispering to every crown wearer, you may hold the throne, but beware the cost of the iron grip. Shadows like these stir something within you. If the echoes of forgotten horrors call to your curiosity, then let your journey not end here. Like this tale, if it chilled your bones, share it with those who dare walk these halls of history. And like, share and subscribe Chanel Bloody History so you do not miss the next chapter, because the past is never truly buried, only waiting to be unearthed.